didn't have no million people out there marching and protesting to get me my job.
No, his uncle got it for him.
In January of 1971, CBS shocked the country with a sitcom unlike anything Americans had ever seen.
Pull that skirt down. Every time you sit down on one of them things, the mystery's over.
Thanks in large part to this man.
My name is Norman Lear.
Today, Norman Lear and his shows are famous, or infamous, depending on who you ask.
Norman Lear is one of the most influential people who ever worked in television.
But in 1971, he was an obscure TV writer and producer, a college dropout, and former Nazi hunter. Norman turned to comedy after World War II. And after years of writing jokes for some of the most famous comics on television, Norman decided it was time for a show of his own.
We were going to make him scream or die in the attempt.
He tackled topics that other TV shows were afraid to go near, from sex to religion to homosexuality.
Why haven't we seen a gay character? I mean, they exist.
I will just say thank you, miss, unless you girls like to be called Ms.
Why don't you call me Mr.?
And he made some powerful enemies.
And he says, they're going to kill you in the streets.
But despite that, Norman's shows transformed American television with one hit after another and changed the lives of people who watched.
I want to thank you for raising me.
Now, Norman says America may be facing its darkest moment yet.
I'm not sure in my 98 years I've seen another moment as worrisome as this.
Which is why, with his over 70 years of experience, he's back with some of his most ambitious projects to date.
The modest mission was to illuminate and repair the world.
And he's got a secret weapon for changing the world yet again.
The great playwrights, the great writers of all time always used comedy.
Comedy actually reveals universal truths.
Yes. God, how laughter can add time. Laughing myself and watching others. That was my life.
Norman Lear was born on July 27th, 1922, just before the worst economic collapse of the 20th century. He was just 7 years old at the start of the Great Depression, when millions of Americans suddenly found themselves struggling to find work to keep a roof over their head and food on the table. In Norman's family, money was tight, tensions were high, and arguments were constant.
They lived at the ends of their nerves and the tops of their lungs.
But that was only the start of their troubles. When Norman was 9, he experienced 2 jolts that opened his eyes to the injustice and absurdity of the world. One was that his father, trying to make ends meet, got caught up in a financial scheme and was sent to jail for trying to sell fake bonds. In his father's absence, the family split up, with Norman sent to live with distant relatives.
At 9, I was forced to become an adult.
The second shock happened around the same time, and it was just as life-changing. Even as a kid, Norman was interested in broadcasting, and he would listen to a little crystal radio at night before bed. One night, he caught a speech by a man named Father Coughlin, a radio preacher whose sermons in the 1930s were heard by about a quarter of Americans. And this is what Norman heard.
I distinguish most carefully between good Jews and bad Jews. In all countries, Jews are in the minority, but a powerful minority in their influence.
Coughlin's speeches in the 1930s railed against what he called international bankers. He blamed Jewish people for their persecution in Europe, and he called for an authoritarian religious rule of the United States through a militia that he personally endorsed called the Christian Front. Coughlin's own biographer called him the father of hate radio. And in the lead-up to World War II, Coughlin's speeches followed a familiar format. Attack minorities, call for their persecution, and declare that his followers were the only true Americans. It was a template that right-wing broadcasters would pick up and follow for decades, even to this day. And years later, Norman wrote that Coughlin's broadcast made him realize the power of radio to sow hateful, bigoted ideas on a mass scale. And even as a boy, he knew that what he was hearing was a dire threat.
How the fuck did I understand that? But I did.
Back then, there wasn't anything he could do about it, but he'd soon get his chance. For the time being, there was one escape available to young Norman Lear.
Well, I fell in love with theater as a kid.
Whenever he could, Norman went to vaudeville shows and got lost in the laughter of the crowd. Comedy called to him, and as a teen, he wrote comedic plays. He dreamed of going to theater school. Even back then, that was pretty expensive. But in 1939, he heard of an opportunity, a speech competition where the first prize was a college scholarship. He wrote an essay called The Constitution and Me about how much the constitutional guarantees of equality and freedom meant to him as a Jewish American, especially in light of the bigotry that he could see growing around the world. Norman poured his heart into that speech, and in the end, he won a full scholarship. In the fall of 1940, he headed to Emerson College in Boston to study theater. But he never graduated. On December 7th of his second year, Norman was in a theater rehearsing for a play when a woman ran in, sobbing, with the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The next day, America declared its entry into World War II, and Norman decided he had to be a part of it.
Being Jewish had everything in the world to do with it.
Although the full extent of the atrocities weren't yet known, it was clear at the time that Germany was mass imprisoning and killing millions of people they considered undesirable. Political dissidents, Jews, Romani, people with disabilities, queer people, and Norman knew that that was an existential threat to people everywhere. It filled him with rage.
All I wanted to do was kill. It's hard to believe I had these feelings in this, as I say, in the same lifetime. But no, I wanted to kill Germans.
He dropped out of school to enlist in the army, volunteering to put his own life on the line to stop the atrocities at any cost. And for the next 3 years, Norman served as a radio operator on bombers based out of Italy. He flew 52 combat missions, he won multiple medals, and he lost many of his friends. But he never lost his resolve.
As a matter of fact, when my tour of duty was over, I volunteered to go into the infantry so I could kill with my hands.
When the war was over, Norman came back to the U.S., ready to put the conflict behind him. He still longed to find a way into theater and to do meaningful work that would make the world a better place. He managed to land a job writing press releases for a PR firm that represented actors in New York. But that job didn't last long. Still a comedian at heart, Norman was fired for sending out press releases full of funny stories about celebrities that he just had to admit were made up. So he headed out to California to try his luck there. Norman was newly married, and he lived with his wife and baby in a one-room shack in Hollywood, while barely scraping together any money as a door-to-door salesman.
I always remember it's the low point, the low point of a difficult time.
But in his free time, he and a friend would write jokes for local performers. One day, Norman decided to take a long shot. He called the office of Danny Thomas, a big-time nightclub and radio comic, and pretended to be a reporter trying to get a hold of Thomas for an article. The secretary believed him and put him through, and as soon as Danny Thomas got on the phone, Norman said he had a great joke to sell him. Thomas was a little annoyed at that, but curious, and he asked to hear it, which meant that Norman had to scramble because he hadn't thought far enough ahead to actually come up with a joke. He stalled just long enough to come up with something, a monologue about 3 funny Yiddish words.
Zimisht, tumult, and farblunchet.
And Danny loved it. He bought it on the spot, used it in his nightclub act, and it killed.
I don't believe there's a cuter story on earth.
From there, Norman suddenly found himself with a job offer, writing jokes full-time for television. He was in the right place at the right time, because this was early in the days of TV comedy, and there were lots of opportunities to make a name for himself. He quickly rose up in the industry, working with Abbott and Costello, Jackie Gleason, Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis.
This is Mr. Lear, one of our crew members, and...
Are we all right? I'm sorry, Mr. Lewis, but something's gone wrong and then we're off the air.
We're off the air. What do you mean we're off the air?
We're on.
Here's one of our technicians.
Everything was finally coming together. But there was a problem. The more time he spent in television, the more frustrated Norman felt. He wanted to write scripts that weren't just funny, but meaningful, that made people laugh while tackling big ideas. But the conventional wisdom of the time was that TV was for light comedy, nothing that might offend. One of Norman's low points was when he wrote a script for Jerry Lewis that he thought made some biting points about showbiz, but...
One of the sketches I thought had something to say, and Jerry had gone completely off, the script.
As Norman later put it, his biting satire reduced to fluff. He was also frustrated that the people running the industry were particularly narrow-minded. For example, in the mid-50s, he was hired to direct a comedy variety show starring Martha Raye, not knowing that the job would nearly doom his career. One episode of the show featured a little girl named Gloria Lockerman, who had recently made headlines for winning a televised spelling contest. Gloria was very sweet, and at the end of the show, the hosts Martha Raye and Tallulah Bankhead came out next to Gloria and did something that many viewers considered unthinkable.
Both Martha and Tallulah hugged and kissed this child.
Because Martha and Tallulah were white and the girl was black, complaints poured in to the show's sponsor, Revlon, and Revlon executives called Norman in a fury.
And we were put on notice. That was the end of the Martha Raye show.
This was by no means unusual. In those days, television regularly excluded or segregated whole swaths of people, limited them to minor roles, or presented them as offensive stereotypes. From racial minorities to religious to queer people, the people you'd see on television back then generally reflected a pretty narrow slice of the country. And after Norman had put his life on the line for ideals like equality and freedom, it was galling to see how his own country and his industry was falling short. But in 1967, he got a chance of a lifetime. Norman's business partner, Bud Yorkin, was in London making a Pink Panther movie. The movie itself was not great.
There is a time for laughing and a time for not laughing, and this is not one of them.
But while he was in England, Yorkin caught a glimpse of a show that blew his mind. It was called Till Death Do Us Part, and it was about a family with conservative parents and progressive kids who argued together over real-world issues.
If ever there was a time in the history of this bloody country when we needed a war, mate, it's now. A war to get rid of most of them. You're mad. No, mad.
Yorkin sent that along to Norman Lear for a possible American adaptation, and Norman was fascinated.
I sat down and did about 100 pages of notes.
Here was a show that did what he had always longed to do with television. It was a comedy, but it wasn't scared of sensitive topics. It was funny and daring. But as he started working on a US adaptation, most people told him it was too daring. When he asked the actor Mickey Rooney if he would play the father on the show, Mickey told him,
"Norm, they're going to kill you. They're going to shoot you dead in the streets."
At the same time, executives at United Artists approached Norman and offered him a deal to direct 3 movies of his choice. When Norman told people that he was torn between adapting an obscure British TV show versus getting a 3-picture deal at a major studio,
there wasn't anybody in my life that didn't beg me to take the 3-picture deal.
But Norman couldn't let the sitcom idea go. Not only was it the show he'd been desperate to make for years, but for him, there was something personal about the family dynamic.
I saw so much of my dad and me in this. It was emotional. I had to do it.
He shopped it around, and to his surprise, ABC was willing to take a chance on the idea. They commissioned him to make a pilot for the show about an aging father who's stuck in the past and constantly argues with his adult kids about hot-button issues.
I didn't have no million people going out in the streets there and marching and protesting to get me my job.
No. His uncle got it for him.
And when they saw the pilot, ABC hated it. They'd just been through a rough controversy with another edgy show called Turn On that was so divisive, in some markets, it was canceled during its first commercial break.
This is not wonderful.
ABC's Turn On is now regarded as one of the most infamous flops in TV history. We don't have time for that whole story here, but I'll be posting a video over on Patreon with all the details, including some clips from the show that to this day have still never been shown on television. Anyway, after a lot of back and forth, ABC decided they wanted nothing to do with Norman's pilot. But as luck would have it, CBS did. They just canceled a bunch of rural-themed shows and were desperate for something that felt new and sophisticated. They bought Norman's show from ABC and had him shoot a new version, now renamed All in the Family, with a revamped cast.
But in my day, get your feet off that furniture.
And they put it on the schedule for January of 1971. By the standards of the time, the opening episode was shocking. The characters openly talked about politics, racism, sex.
Your mother-in-law and me was going around together. It was 2 whole years. We never... I mean, there was nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. Not till the wedding night.
Yeah, and even then.
CBS was so worried they'd get complaints, they put a warning message before the show.
Warning, the program you are about to see is All in the Family.
But as it turned out, they hardly got any calls, because not a lot of people watched.
It was at the bottom of the ratings.
The initial silence from viewers wasn't great, but at least it meant that the sailing was smooth enough that the show could continue, and keep pushing the envelope. And that's just what Norman did. As showrunner, he told the writers to look for story ideas in the newspapers, to listen to what their families were talking about at the dinner table. He wanted to broach topics that nobody ever saw on TV before, including...
We haven't seen a gay character. Why haven't we seen a gay character? They bring their own stories to families all the time.
Prior to this, if you saw any acknowledgement of homosexuality on TV, it tended to be in news specials about how it was a threat to public safety, or in serious dramas where it was treated as a sickness.
Such a strong affection between 2 young men is not what you'd call perfectly ordinary, everyday, natural.
But All in the Family took a different approach. Early in season 1, there's an episode in which Archie, the conservative dad, insists he can tell a gay person just by looking at him.
Just because a guy is sensitive and he's an intellectual and he wears glasses, you make him out a queer. I never said a guy who wears glasses is a queer.
A guy who wears glasses is a four eyes. A guy who's a fag is a queer.
But the younger characters stick up for queer people, a big shift from earlier shows.
His pal Roger is as queer as a $4 bill, and he knows it.
That's not only cruel, Daddy, that's an outright lie.
Meanwhile, the audience can see that Archie is totally oblivious to the fact that his friend, a macho football player, is gay, even after that friend tries to tell Archie that the rumors about him are true.
How long you known me? 10, 12 years?
Yeah?
In all that time, did I ever mention a woman?
Well, what difference does that make? You're a bachelor.
Ultimately, the episode's about how it's wrong to judge people based on stereotypes. Gay viewers were thrilled. After that episode aired, an anonymous group of gay doctors, lawyers, and pilots wrote a letter thanking them for being one of the very rare shows that cast a favorable and honest light on homosexuality. And that was just the first of numerous episodes of All in the Family that included queer people. From a gay teacher, to a drag performer, to even briefly showing two men making out. At first, it took a while for All in the Family to catch on. At the end of its first season, the show was ranked 34th out of all shows. But over the summer reruns, word started to get around. And by the end of season 2, it had climbed to the #1 show on television, thanks to a mix of daring content and very funny writing.
I mean, if God had meant us to be together, he'd have put us together. Well, look what he's done. He put you over in Africa, he put the rest of us in all the white countries.
Well, you must have told him where we were, because somebody came and got it.
All in the Family remained the single most watched show on television for half a decade. It was nominated for so many awards.
Johnny Carson opened the Emmy show saying, "Welcome to the Norman Lear Show."
And before long, they started to get feedback from viewers. Lots of it.
We used to get a ton of mail, sometimes 5,000 letters a week.
Many people were alarmed about the show. It seemed like with the Archie character, they were giving a Father Coughlin type a brand new soapbox. But unlike those sermons that Norman had heard as a kid, All in the Family had characters who would push back and hold the bigotry up for ridicule. And seeing that prompted many viewers to rethink their own ideas.
And the guy would write, I looked in the mirror when I was shaving and I saw Archie Bunker and I didn't like it.
As the show grew more popular, Norman and his company started looking for more ways to break new ground on television. In the second season, they wrote an episode featuring Edith's cousin Maude, played by B. Arthur.
Archie, you can have your chair. Only don't move around too much. You'll crush your brains.
The character was so well received that they created a whole new show centered around her. Maude was a new kind of character for television, an outspoken feminist who tackles issues like marijuana laws, alcoholism, birth control.
More and more men are talking about vasectomy all the time.
Walter's been talking about it for 2 years. Take it from me, Arthur. Talking about it doesn't work.
Topics that many viewers of the time found shocking.
And now I have a 5-year-old granddaughter, after seeing All in the Family, asked me to explain to her what is a vasectomy.
But that others were eager to finally be able to discuss.
Why can't you explain it? What's wrong with a vasectomy?
It also had a groundbreaking episode about abortion, written by Susan Harris. Susan Harris would go on to create The Golden Girls a few years later with B. Arthur and another Maude actress, Rue McClanahan. So you can trace the seeds of The Golden Girls back to this initial collaboration on Norman's shows. And just as with All in the Family, Maude featured multiple episodes with gay characters. One episode is partially set in a gay bar.
You don't think they look like us, do you?
Well, that guy sure does. He's wearing the same jacket you are.
And prior to this, TV gay bars had generally been shown as dark, dingy, forbidden, dangerous places.
The homosexual, bitterly aware of his rejection, responds by going underground. They frequent their own clubs and bars and coffee houses where they can act out in the fashion that they want to.
But Maude challenged that depiction by showing a gay bar that was friendly, welcoming, just a nice place to hang out.
Place is very respectable. Quiet, customers well behaved. The only thing I find objectionable is that man's tasteless sport coat.
For gay viewers, that meant a chance to see that they weren't alone. And for straight viewers, it was a chance to see past the negative stereotypes that didn't reflect reality. Lear also broke new ground on a show called One Day at a Time, which was one of the first to feature a divorced single mom with kids.
And it was almost shocking in 1975 that the single mom would actually have a boyfriend and spend the night with him and then talk to her teenage daughters about sex and birth control.
Norman also co-created multiple shows that focused on black families and that hired black writers to tell their stories. It started with Sanford & Son in 1972.
What am I going to do with all these bills? I'll tell you what to do with them. Put them back in the mailbox.
And as a sign of just how segregated television still was, Sanford & Son almost never made it to air. While it was in development, Norman tried to get CBS executives to take a look at it, but they were totally disinterested, even though Norman was developing it at CBS's own studio. So in frustration, Norman called some executives at NBC and told them about the show. They were excited and they wanted to see a rehearsal, so Norman had to secretly sneak those executives into the CBS offices to take a look. They loved what they saw, they bought the show. Sanford & Son became a colossal hit.
It's about a junk dealer and his son who live in a ghetto. And that's it. Now, are there any last-minute questions? Where's my $1 million?
That was followed by Good Times, spin-off from Maude in 1974.
The blouse is from your old blue, the skirt is from your old red, and the belt is from the old sofa.
And then, with those two shows on the air, Lear started to hear some criticism, that they were only depicting black families as financially struggling. So he and his partners created a third show about a black family that was economically well off.
You live in this apartment, right?
Uh-huh.
And you got an apartment in this building, too?
Yes, that's right.
Well, how come we overcame and nobody told me?
The Jeffersons even included an interracial couple, the first on television.
May we come in?
The wife was played by Roxy Roker. That's Lenny Kravitz's mother.
We came down here in the spirit of friendship.
Then that's a good way for you to leave, in the spirit of friendship.
Now look here, shorty.
And the Jeffersons was unapologetic about showing the interracial couple kissing.
Beg your pardon, I'll come back later.
Audiences embraced the show's diverse cast. Quite a change from the days when Norman saw the Martha Raye show canceled after showing a white woman hugging a black child. And not only that, but the Jeffersons also broke new ground with an ahead-of-its-time episode in which George Jefferson finds out that one of his friends is trans.
It's me, Eddie, only I'm Edie now.
Previously, TV had almost never acknowledged the existence of trans people, aside from mocking jokes. But here, after he gets over his surprise, George fully accepts her. This was likely the first openly trans character that most Americans of the time saw, and they saw that she was happy, successful, and a great friend.
You saved my marriage, I'll never forget it.
What are friends for?
Hey, that's right.
After that, in 1976, another of Norman's shows, Mary Hartman, featured a gay couple as recurring characters. Prior to this, shows tended to show same-sex couples as sick, often the product of a pervert seducing an innocent heterosexual.
If you really love her, let her lead a normal life.
What do you mean by that exactly?
Something that isn't unnatural.
Or something that needed to be fixed by trying a heterosexual relationship.
Shouldn't I have a complete relationship with a man to find out whether I could have a straight life?
But on Mary Hartman, the gay couple is well-adjusted, they're in love, they're even contemplating marriage, decades before marriage equality became a real possibility.
You said something about making it legal?
Marriage?
If the offer's still good, the answer is yes.
Yeah, the offer's still good.
Of course, there was still plenty of opposition to what Norman was doing. His shows often terrified network executives. He had such a reputation for pushing the envelope that here he is playing a parody version of himself on Saturday Night Live.
What is new with the new series? The daughter is a nun, and their son is a gay state trooper.
But when executives wanted to rein him in, he had a way of standing up to them.
How do you fight that? How do you...
Yeah, we were... I won't be in tomorrow.
You just threatened to quit.
Each time.
And then there was the outcry from conservatives, who were furious about the expanding boundaries on television.
The Reverend Jerry Falwell called you the #1 enemy of the American family.
Number one.
Number one, yes.
Goals.
How could you not be proud of that?
Yeah.
And he made some even more powerful enemies, starting with that early episode of All in the Family featuring Archie's gay friend. Richard Nixon happened to watch that episode of All in the Family, and he was horrified. White House tapes caught Nixon shouting in fury.
Goddamn, I do not think that you glorify on public television homosexuality.
And Nixon wasn't alone. Republican politicians saw a chance to whip up their base into an outrage. They called for a blanket ban on all controversial content and lumped inclusive shows like Norman's in with more explicit shows that featured graphic sex and violence. The networks were terrified that Congress might take control of their companies. So under pressure, in the fall of 1975, they created a program called the Family Viewing Hour, which essentially banned sex and violence during primetime, and also any mention of homosexuality. I talked about this more in my videos about Alice and Barney Miller, but basically, the rules were a huge burden on everyone. And so confusing and vague, it was hard to tell why certain content was suddenly off limits.
It's a big hassle for us because suddenly at 9 o'clock you can say hell,
At 8 o'clock, you can't say hell.
And they won't let us say hanky-panky.
The family viewing hour resulted in a near-total rollback of the progress of the previous few years. Lear and his colleagues were outraged.
Writers and most of the people that work with me now feel a sense of prior censorship.
Sometimes the censorship was ridiculous.
We did an episode in which Archie Bunker was going to diaper his grandson for the first time. That was, 11 hours of man-hours of discussion about whether a man should be able to diaper his grandson.
But the pressure to avoid controversy could also be much more insidious, and harken back to television's earlier days, when there was only one limited view allowed of what Americans should look like.
Writers by the dozen see characters change from black to white and from Jewish to Gentile to avoid offending anyone.
Norman was keenly aware of the threat this posed, so he reached out to folks working on other shows who are also frustrated. That included Mary Tyler Moore and Danny Arnold, who co-created Bewitched and Barney Miller, Larry Gelbart from MASH. They announced a lawsuit against the networks and the federal government over the family viewing hour. Their argument was that the pressure from the federal regulators amounted to government censorship, that these were conversations real Americans were having, and politicians shouldn't be able to censor them.
What we're doing is nothing that you wouldn't hear in a playground of a school anywhere. I mean, this is America.
It was particularly ridiculous, Norman said, because the politicians trying to crack down on them were the same ones having those conversations themselves.
What could prove it better than to have the President of the United States engaged just as any ordinary guy might be engaged in a conversation from his point of view about that show?
The lawsuit worked its way through the courts, and then, in the fall of 1976, a judge ruled that because the federal government had pressured the networks to come up with a family viewing hour, it amounted to an unconstitutional intrusion on free speech. The family viewing hour was dead. And that wasn't just good news for Norman's shows. It set a precedent that the government couldn't unduly restrict broadcasts simply for being controversial. And that cleared a path for existing shows to bring back queer characters, which they immediately did. Not just on Norman's shows, but on others like Bob Newhart.
It just happens that I happen to have a patient now who's gay and he's going through a very difficult time.
Barney Miller.
What's wrong with a gay cop? There are gay robbers.
Phyllis.
Scott is homosexual.
No, Phyllis, no husband is perfect.
And it cleared a path for future shows to do the same. And sure enough, in the years that followed, there were more and more queer characters on network television. From comedies...
Are you a practicing homosexual? I don't have to practice. I'm very good at it.
...to dramas...
The Sugar's giving you the 8:30 show.
Honey, they couldn't live through the 8:30 show.
...to made-for-TV movies.
You know, all of us are tempted.
And that was thanks, in part, to the door that Norman helped open, and kept open for everyone that followed. Of course, out of the dozens of shows that Norman created, not all were hits. But even the experiments that failed to find an audience still dared to try new things. For example, in 1975, the show Hot L Baltimore included an elderly same-sex couple, and it shows characters standing up to bigots who harass them. In 1976, the show All's Fair starred Bernadette Peters as a progressive woman who boldly stands up to her conservative husband, at a time when a lot of shows still treated men as the indisputable head of the household.
Now let me tell you something, my wilted flower child.
You've lost your temper.
I have not lost it. I have found it.
Then in 1977, the show All That Glitters skewered gender roles by imagining a world in which women were the dominant gender and men were subservient to them.
The idea for All That Glitters was that we rewrote Genesis. And man was taken from the rib of a woman. And
All That Glitters even featured a trans character as part of the core cast, the first transgender main character on American television. And even though some of Norman's shows were, on occasion, real dogs.
I woke up this morning. I guess it was the usual time. I don't know for sure. I can't tell time. I'm a dog.
Most of them were hits, and each one pushed the envelope a little further, included characters and stories that had never been seen on TV, and opened doors for more inclusive shows to follow. And that was especially true in the 1980s, when Norman helped produce some of the most iconic programs of the decade. And although he wasn't creatively involved in every show, his company Embassy Television was home to Different Strokes, Facts of Life, Who's the Boss, 227, even Married with Children, just to name a few. Huge hits, and it's impossible to imagine what TV would have been in the 80s and evolved into in the 90s without them. And of all the projects that Norman had a hand in, or that his company helped produce, the most consistent elements was including people who had previously been left out, and telling stories about the real-life problems that they faced.
These were the problems of American families. They were as available to us as life itself, because we were all living it.
Having those people on TV starting in the 70s was particularly important because in real life, it was a time of unprecedented social change, especially for queer people. That era marked the first prides, the delisting of homosexuality as a mental illness, and the first laws protecting queer people's civil rights. And Norman's shows made it possible for TV to tell stories about those lives, and to show why expanding protections mattered so much.
We were in the midst of a revolution of talking about ideas. Mainstream television was one of the last things to jump. And the first person to force it over that hill was Norman.
But then in the early 80s, Norman started to see a new threat that had echoes of an old one.
We've got to raise up an army of men and women in America who'll call this nation back to moral sanity and sensibility.
Around that time, there was a surge in conservative media, particularly televangelists. People like Pat Robertson, Jimmy Swaggart, Jerry Falwell. There were a couple reasons for that rise, like an increase in access to satellite and cable TV, but also deregulation that made it possible for religious groups to buy airtime and broadcast sermons that were explicitly political without losing their tax-exempt status. These preachers spoke openly about wanting to turn the country into a theocracy that they controlled.
Our form of government came directly from the Bible.
And one of their frequent tactics was a callback to Father Coughlin. Scapegoat minorities and label them enemies of the country.
My friend, God Almighty does not hear the prayer of a Jew.
Especially, this time, queer people.
I'm sick and tired of hearing about all of the radicals and the perverts and the liberals and the leftists and the communists coming out of the closets. It's time for God's people to come out of the closet.
This new wave of televangelists told millions of followers that anyone who didn't agree with them was unchristian, un-American, should be excluded from public life.
I don't want everybody to vote. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down.
And also, of course, they saw it as a means to get rich.
I'm asking you for $100,000 tonight. I sincerely believe it to be in God's will for us to have.
By this time, Norman was approaching his 60s, and he'd lived through enough times like these to recognize what he was seeing.
I was deeply concerned when Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson were proliferating on the tube and on radio and so forth, claiming that you were a good or a bad Christian depending on your political point of view.
Norman decided to strike back, using the tools that he knew best.
I thought, I want to take the flag and the Bible back for all of us. And the way I know how to do it is television.
He started with a series of TV commercials, urging people not to be so easily manipulated by charismatic religious leaders.
So maybe there's something wrong when people, even preachers, suggest that other people are good Christians or bad Christians, depending on their political views.
Next, he produced a special called I Love Liberty, celebrating the values that he felt were the most urgent to defend. Equality, diversity, making sure the law protects and serves everyone, especially the most vulnerable.
The mandate was to defend pluralism and the First Amendment and the separation of church and state from an onslaught of TV ministries that went so far as to ask audiences to pray that the Supreme Court died in its sleep.
In the special, Robin Williams gives a speech in character as the American flag.
People say, "Flag, how do you stay so young? Is it jogging? No. Is it tennis? No. It's waving."
Barbra Streisand sings America the Beautiful.
God shed his grace on thee.
And the founding of the country is reenacted by the Muppets.
The United States of America was founded in the midst of chaos.
Woo! My kind of country.
After that, Norman could see there was lots more work to do. So, using the attention from the ads and the special as a jumping off point, he founded a new organization to counter the forces of bigotry. He called it People for the American Way, and he made it his full-time focus, stepping away from the industry that he helped shape so he could devote himself to the cause.
He decided to retire from his successful television shows to really devote his life to activism.
I was not thinking I was leaving the entertainment business. I was thinking it's all the entertainment business.
The timing was perfect, since Ronald Reagan had just been elected president, thanks in part to televangelists who ordered their followers to vote for him. And throughout the 80s, Republicans pushed hard to enshrine religious bigotry into law. For example, at one point, Reagan nominated Robert Bork to the Supreme Court. Bork was a former Nixon sidekick who openly said that he wanted to roll back civil rights protections for minorities. In response, People for the American Way leapt into action, and they launched a campaign to oppose the nomination.
You opposed a civil rights law that ended whites-only signs at lunch counters. Please urge your senators to vote against the Bork nomination. Because if Robert Bork wins a seat on the Supreme Court, it will be for life. His life and yours.
Norman and People for the American Way mobilized people across the country to contact their legislators. And sure enough, Congress rejected Bork's nomination, one of the few times that's happened.
In Robert Bork's America, there is no room at the inn for blacks and no place in the Constitution for women. And in our America, there should be no seat on the Supreme Court for Robert Bork.
People for the American Way also led campaigns to stop groups from forcing public schools to buy religious textbooks. When conservatives tried to ban library books with inclusive content, People for the American Way successfully filed lawsuits to stop them. They helped pass non-discrimination ordinances around the country, and in response to a rise in right-wing extremism, they created Right Wing Watch to expose hateful speakers, a tool that many came to rely on.
One of my favorite things that PFAW does is they have this Right Wing Watch. The only downside, every time I read their blog, I gotta hire a guy to come in and patch up all the holes I punched in the drywall.
And in addition to People for the American Way, Norman helped found another organization that had a big impact on the country.
The modest mission was to illuminate and repair the world.
The Norman Lear Center at USC provides expert advice to TV shows that tackle sensitive subjects.
We work with hundreds and hundreds of shows to help them research the information they needed for the stories they already wanted to tell.
Today, so many shows use the Norman Lear Center that chances are pretty good you've seen episodes of television that they helped with.
We call them for everything. I don't even know how they have other jobs besides Grey's Anatomy because we call them like weekly.
The center doesn't tell shows what to say. They just help shows get the details right.
We have the facts and it's in the interest of these writers and content creators to tell stories that are factually accurate because these narratives affect audiences.
And they know that those shows affect audiences because the center also studies the impact before and after broadcast.
We always make sure to return back to the shows to let them know what the results were of our impact studies. It reminds them about the power of their work.
For instance, reports from the Norman Lear Center pinpointed ways that shows like Will and Grace improved public opinions towards queer people, or how episodes of Grey's Anatomy spurred people to become organ donors.
You know, they've done just a glorious job and made an enormous, I would say, national impact.
For more than 20 years, the center's been helping shows follow in Norman's footsteps, using their platform to make the world a better place. It's a cause that for Norman is deeply personal.
I hope on behalf of my kids and grandkids that America finds its way. And when we've gotten to the other side of that, I believe the center will have mattered.
Not only that, but Norman's work has inspired numerous other people. For example, Rob Reiner, who played Michael on All in the Family back in the 1970s.
He's like a second father to me. You know, I owe a tremendous amount to Norman Lear.
Norman had long been a mentor to Rob.
One of the great kicks of my life was helping Rob Reiner make his first 4 films. We made Spinal Tap, Stand By Me, The Princess Bride.
And after following in Norman's footsteps in entertainment, Rob followed him into activism. After California passed a ban on marriage equality in 2008, Rob helped start an organization to challenge the ban, bringing a case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and ultimately winning.
Everyone should be allowed to marry the person they love.
But for all the progress that's been made over the last few years, more recently, Norman's seen an alarming new trend.
I'm not sure in my 98 years I've seen another moment as worrisome as this.
In interviews today, Norman has described a level of intolerance that he hasn't seen in a long time. Now, he says, bigots seem more emboldened than ever, with brazen displays of pro-Nazi sentiment. For all the times that Norman says he's seen that ideology before, he's never seen it expressed so openly.
But I don't recall people in the streets marching and showing hateful signs, you know, anti-Semitism. That worries me considerably now.
And you don't have to look hard to find conservatives targeting minorities, labeling them enemies of the country, and calling for violence against them.
The transgender movement in this country, if there's a movement in this country that is demonic.
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely.
They are not right when they preach tolerance and free speech. Ammo's expensive. Don't waste a bullet on a warning shot.
But if there's any good news, it's that folks like Norman have first-hand experience dealing with times like these. And he has some ideas about how to respond. For one thing, he's revisited his most classic episodes about tackling bigotry, broadcasting them with all new performers.
Boy, the way Glenn Miller played.
Songs that made the hit parade.
He's also rebooted some of his classic shows, like One Day at a Time, which has been updated to focus on a Latino family. The new incarnation of the show even has multiple queer people, including a rare non-binary character.
You won't tell us who your secret girlfriend P is, so we pulled up your Instagram and narrowed it down to 15 possible girls.
Incidentally, 15 Possible Girls would be a great name for a genderqueer punk band.
And he's developing a whole slate of new shows.
Half a dozen are in the works. We will be making 10 episodes of one of the shows.
And although it might seem like at this point Norman's explored every story there is to tell, he's still finding new ones. One of his projects currently in development is based on a memoir called The Pink Marine, written by a closeted gay soldier who served in the army in the 1980s. It's yet another perspective that's been almost totally overlooked by television, for now. Now, obviously, sitcoms alone can't single-handedly solve all the world's problems. But if there's anything that the decades of Norman's work makes clear, it's the power of laughter to help people see the world in a new way.
Comedy can be an intravenous, in one's arm. You're laughing and absorbing at the same time.
To introduce new ideas.
Where I think I learned how to process complex thoughts, things that I really cared about through the lens of comedy, was watching Norman Lear shows.
And to give people a vision of how to live together.
Flying across country at night, but I remember looking down for the first time thinking, hey, it's just possible wherever I see a light, I've helped to make somebody laugh.
The work that Norman's done hasn't always been easy.
This was a stressful existence.
But not only has it kept him vital for the last century.
But talk about joyful. I was paid handsomely to laugh. I'm 40 years old. These lines are laugh lines.
It's had an immeasurable impact on the world, breaking down barriers that kept certain people from appearing on TV.
I just wanted to say to you, Beverly, for a name, you're one hell of a guy.
Exposing bigots for how ridiculous they truly are.
Has it ever occurred to you that gay people are human beings, that they have rights?
Sure, Maud. If it was up to you, everybody'd have rights.
And showing viewers what it looks like to confront prejudice head on.
And if you were prejudiced, you'd walk around thinking that you're better than anybody else in the world. But I can honestly say, having spent these marvelous moments with you, you ain't better than anybody.
So now he's starting his second century of making the world a better place for everyone.
Norman, the simple truth is we love you. We admire you. We're all convinced you'll outlive us. Congratulations on your first 100, my friend.
There's so much more to say about Norman's life and career, like how the Smithsonian once recognized All in the Family by paying tribute to Edith Bunker's butt.
I always knew Jean's tushy would be celebrated somewhere.
Or the incredible show that Mickey Rooney wanted Norman to make instead of All in the Family.
Ex-Vietnam vet, blind, private eye, large dog.
And a show that Norman did in the early 80s that starred B. Arthur and Fran Drescher. I've got bonus videos about all that over on Patreon, and you can now sign up to watch all the bonus videos for free with a 1-week trial. And if you want even more sitcom history, check out my new book, Hi Honey, I'm Homo. It's available now wherever books are sold, and it includes an exclusive interview that I did with Norman Lear himself. You can get all the details on the book and get a signed copy at gaysitcoms.com. Huge thanks to everyone who helped me with this video, especially the folks at People for the American Way. You can check out all their great work at pfaw.org. Thanks to Jim Colucci, whose book All in the Family is absolutely indispensable. And thanks to everybody who makes my videos possible with your support on Patreon. Now, if you'll excuse me, I told Norman we'd meet up at the end of this video.
Oh, let's go to the rap party.